pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to finally be able to give back. So many years I've gone to this sessions and workshops, and now hopefully you will be able to gain from the different sources that we're going to learn together. High holidays growing up was the most awesome time. Literally, there was never a second to breathe. Whether it's preparing for Rosh Hashanah, during Elul, or the Shofar, whether it's high holidays, whether it's the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, everything is always a blur. We usually call it the Jewish boiler. It's like the boiler point. You're always something busy. And what I'd like to challenge with us is to take some sources and understand some of the sentiments and themes of the high holidays. And then what can we do to take that energy and bring it out to the youth? I was thinking that it would be a good way to learn is if we broke up into small little groups and went through the sources as Chavruta and then read through it. I have some discussion questions that are at the end of the first source sheet, and then we can come together and discuss them as a group. So I'm just going to have these pass by. My intention is not to lecture, but more to facilitate these discussions. So find a partner or two and just read through it. I will revolve around the room to go through some of the sheets. And just listen through. Or if you prefer, since we're a small group, we could do it all together. What do you prefer?
Let's do it together.
Let's do it together. Okay. Who wants to read the first source?
Is that the Deuteronomy one?
Yes. Sorry, I didn't put page numbers.
I'm happy to do it.
Go for it.
אתם ניצבים היום כולכם לפני אדוני אלוהיכם, ראשיכם, שבטיכם, זקניכם, ושוטריכם כל איש ישראל. תבחן נשיכם בגרך אשר בקרב מחניך, וכותב עציך עד שואב ממך, ובחר בברית אדוני אלוהיך, ועלתו אשר אדוני אלוהיך כורת עמך היום.
So, how do you understand that? What does it say in a basic first glance?
We're all in it together.
We're all in it together. We're all here. Whether it's the most scholarly person to the regular person. I had one Shabbat evening, I was sitting at the Happy Minyan and my kids were making a bunch of noise and some guy started shushking my kids. And one of the guys who was an organizer at the Happy Minyan said to me, if he wants to shush, that's fine. He can go to another shul. For us, it's all about bringing in the kids and having them scream and shout and participating in the experience. So it's all about every age group, every part of our community. The first Chabad Rabbi Shneur Zalman Vliadi, brought in an interesting idea to this Atem Nitzavim Hayom. We are standing here today. Who would like to read source 2?
Today refers to Rosh Hashanah, on which you, all Jews from your heads until your water drawers, all are standing before God your Lord, for the purpose of crossing you into the pact of God your Lord.
How do we understand this? What is the different parts of this particular quote?
So we say, what is Hayom?
Hayom.
We have an issue there, so what day is it? And he offers that it is Rosh Hashanah.
Rosh Hashanah. So what is the theme of Rosh Hashanah? What are we trying to accomplish? What are we coming together as a community? Malchiyot. So we're going to get that in the next source. But Tshuva.
Yeah, I think it's Yom HaDin.
Yom
That we
HaDin.
all get judged on one level, no matter if you are the heads to the water drawers or crossing over together.
Okay, so we basically, it doesn't matter who or where we are in the world, we're equals. That's the way I look at what you're saying.
Can I just interject? David Allenson likes to teach on this text, and he points out that, and I don't know where he gets the source from. I have to check in with it, but he talks about wood choppers to the water drawers. That you'd think it would be from, temporary context, the cleaning staff to the executive director, or from the lowliest to the highest, or something like that. Wood choppers and water drawers seem to be two equal. So what's the meaning? And he brings in the teaching that Chotev Etzecha is Abraham Avinu, who prepared the wood for the binding of Isaac, and the water drawer comes from the line Shavtim Mayim V'Sasomi Minei HaYeshua. That's the time of the Mashiach. And so this isn't so much a statement of from the lowliest to the highest, but from the very beginning of Judaism until the end of Judaism.
Wow.
From Abraham
Jews
through
from
the
all time.
Mashiach. That's the whole spectrum.
I love it. That's so profound.
Mm.
That's amazing. And feel free to add. Bring in your own ideas. Something that you've heard.
I think it's saying that we're all equal, we're all necessary.
Yes.
And that in the session that I was just in, the importance of doing teshuvah in community, visibly with other people, and the realization also that there is going to be a balance of talents within the community of Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara, that you're going to learn from it and you're going to support each other. At home it's easy to spiral up or down and be very self-centered. In other places you're looking around and you are in it together. Am Yisrael.
For sure. We are all part of a cohesive unit. When I just got back from a 2-week, 10-day birthright trip in Israel with a group of young professionals. And one of the ideas I tried to impart in these kids, young professionals from across the spectrum, literally of very little involvement or even synagogue membership at all. Many of them never even experienced the bar mitzvah. And the idea that we are part of this tradition, that we are standing in a place that our forefathers stood, that we are standing in a place that we are a continuation of that transformation, that we are essential to that whole Jewish experience as a whole, is so important that they are I'm challenging them to take ownership. So this is it. Atam Nitzavim, we are all standing here to take ownership of our Jewish experience. Who wants to go to the next source? Yeah, if you want to.
Ein pohasi me'esu malchius, me'asora zekronos, me'asora shoforos. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri omer, im amoran sholosh yotzo. Ein maskirin zikoron malchus, v'shofar shoforonos. Maschil betoro, u'mesayim benovi. Rabbi Yosef omer, im hishlim betoro yotzo. Okay,
so that's in the context of the previous source where we say Malchus, Zechronos, and Shofros. One Malchus, Zechronos, and Shofros, those parts of the Musaf prayer are so that we bring God's kingdom upon us. Zechronos is that we should be remembered for good. This has a prevalence in the Rosh Hashanah source in 4:6 that how often are we mentioning all this stuff? It's almost, if you look through the whole service, it's like repetitive. It's going on and on and on and on, over and over and over again. And how do we? I was at Cage yesterday, and we were talking about repetitive learning, all those Mavis Beacon type of computer programs where you're just typing over and over and over and over again, repeating the same thing. How do we drill this idea, this relationship that Malchios, Chronos, and Shofros are something real that we're trying to impart in our communities, in ourselves, and our families? What do you think? Any suggestions?
So Atem Nitzavim is a collective, and another purpose for having so many psukim is that even within each individual, but certainly within the collective that's standing there on the day of Rosh Hashanah, one pasuk may not speak to one, but another will. So part of drilling is to do it until we hit that moment where there's the connection. And so one year, I'm a chazan primarily, and I find the same thing. I complain of the repetitiveness too. So we get to that point of the day, and I find myself grabbing on to different pasukim, different years, and I'm hoping my confidence are doing the same.
Excellent. Anybody else have anything to add?
Malchios, we're reminding ourselves of it, even in all the tefillas, Melech HaKodesh, it's all revolving around that idea that we have to remind ourselves of these three qualities. Isn't it the whole,
Yeah,
the whole
absolutely.
high holiday period?
You know, how do we imagine a king? How can we relate to a king in our own personal lives? Do we have a figure that imbues that type of reverence, that type of experience in our lives? Can you think of someone alive today that you could say, okay, that I can understand the relationship of a king and a subject? We understand that we say Avinu Malkeinu, a father, our king. Our father, we understand the father relationship. We understand the relationship between a servant and a master. We can understand that. How do we understand? How do we realize the connection between a king and a subject?
I don't have a good visual image for that. I don't have a good answer in that way. But what I try to think of is the authority in my moral and ethical life. That as I have to make moral and ethical decisions each day, what is my authority beyond? Well, it feels good. I just want to do it. And so I do.
There was once a group. Joe,
I think that's the hardest of the three to kind of connect to, because I think this idea of memory, the idea of the past, the fact that you're a part of something much bigger, is something people can connect to. Shafarot, this idea of what is our responsibility, how are we going to actually play a role in the world, I think people connect to. This idea that you are subject to something that is not visible and that we have no model of as you're mentioning in our lives, I think is, I think about people in my community, it's this most challenging issue. So I think that's what I struggle with, is trying to, could you put all of these in kind of a timeline, so it's past, present, and future, and in that sense, then you can kind of create a way in which people can connect to this idea of memory, present role in the world today, and the possibility in the future. But in terms of this idea of a subject to king, is really very challenging.
So there was a group of Hasidim sitting together after the fall of the Tsar, and they were both celebrating and lamenting, as it goes in the Jewish community. Always we have mixed feelings about everything, and they're happy that the Tsar who persecuted the Jews was ousted from power, but at the same time, the ability to be able to explain when you go to the high holidays and say, there is a king, and that relationship with the king, and the trepidation that you have when you walk into the chamber of the king, and what you say could be life or death was something real at the time. Today, they don't have that experience. And so it's interesting how do we take the ideas of the high holidays, the ideas that are actual Jewish experiences throughout the year, and actually bring them to what we relate to in our own way. Who would like to read the next source? Go for it.
Even though the blowing of the shofar at Rosh Hashanah is a scriptural dictate, it contains an allusion as if to say, awaken sleepers from your sleep, slumberers arise from your stupor, and suspect your deeds and return in repentance and recall your freedom.
Calling out. We have all the explanations of where the whole idea of blowing the shofar, the idea of Sisera calling out from her heart for her son, that it's more than just speech. The calling out without any actual words is that calling out from the essence of one's heart, calling out that cleaving to something greater, something beyond oneself. Anybody have something, interpretation that they would like to share from this source? Okay, who wants to read the next source? Go for it.
The sounding of the shofar is part of the coronation ceremony, just as horns and trumpets are sounded when the king is coronated. So too do we sound the shofar in Rosh Hashanah when we coronate God as King of the universe.
So another part of the shofar blowing is not merely to a call out of tshuva, but a call out of celebration. For me, growing up, I always felt that Rosh Hashanah was a happy time. It wasn't a serious time. Yom Kippur was more of a serious time. I always felt guilty when I was having a lot of fun on Rosh Hashanah, and I'm like, no, this is what it is. It's a celebration. It's a coronation. It's something that we are renewing and reinvigorating our relationship to God as a king. It's pretty loud.
I think one of
Almost
the,
impossible.
I guess they were sent to discuss amongst themselves, but anyway, so one of the things that I think you're very right, it is the most difficult piece to connect with, is that idea of kingship, coronation, etc. But it can also be something that you do. I work primarily with bar mitzvah kids, and they're a very fragile transition. And when they're called upon to lead the Amidah, and we go back through the choreography and we say, what are you bowing down to? I mean, it's almost a universal Jewish practice. You're bowing at the beginning of the Amidah and in certain prescribed places throughout. What are you bowing to? And I think for a lot of them, it works for me to discuss with them, not as much because they're still very young, and even for us, whatever age, not what you're bowing to, but what are you not bowing to? And an opportunity to say, what is it that Jews have held most high, as opposed to kind of what society as a whole tends to worship, whether it's money or it's sports figures or it's fame or it's the ego self, either gesture of the time. What is it when you're bowing in front of your friends and family at your bar mitzvah, and even as you go on in life as a Jew, what is it at that moment that you're bowing to? And it's an opportunity to kind of restate those values.
And we're bowing as we relinquish control of our lives, which is so hard to do as human beings and as Americans. It's a hard thing to do, but we are relinquishing. It's like we're not in control. There's something that's bigger.
I have a question I've been working on. I mean, it's true we're lucky enough to live in a democracy, so it's hard in that way. But I feel like Chazal was also struggling with this in two ways, and even that melech is one of the best words we've come up with for God, and I'm sort of I'm a Maimonidean this way. I think all words are at best metaphors. And I love that phrase, what are you not bound to? But kings, human kings, both in Sefer Dvarim and in Sefer Shmuel, it's clear that human kings are bad, including Jewish kings. And so our tradition itself has a complicated relationship with the word Malchuyot in order to draw us to there's only one Melech and God is it. Any human that uses the word Melech is Layan. So I almost want to celebrate the fact that we don't know what a king is. I don't know how to do it, but that's anyway.
No, that's an important thing. I mean, I would agree with you that any description of God is always a attempt for us to relate to an understanding of a God. That it's only a description to enable us to how do we bring examples and use analogies to be able to get to appreciation for a concept that's much broader and greater. But yes, maybe it is an advantage of not having a king. That we can just say, okay, what is that relationship with king? How do we identify that with our relationship with God? I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
You had just said that, but it's been going through my head is, you're saying in Yom Kippur and at the High Holy Days, what is my relationship with God? What is my relationship with man? What is my relationship with myself? And where do I need to ask forgiveness or extend forgiveness to bring my life back in balance? When you bow, the original thing is that is an act of surrender. It's an act of acceptance, but also you expose the nape of your neck. And there are those who teach that if you're doing particularly if you're doing completely a silent Amidah, that you hold that posture and think about what that means. To say, I am exposing my neck to the inexplicable and the unknowable.
Wow, that's profound. I gotta write that down afterwards. Anybody else have anything else to add to this particular piece? Flip the page. This is an excerpt from a Tshuva drasha from Soloveitchik. And I think it brings out a couple different elements that are relevant to this discussion. Who would like to?
Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, in his 1974 Teshuvah Darash, explains that our actions on Rosh Hashanah have an effect on God. The Almighty is the greatest subject, but He can also be an object. At times, He is influenced by human behavior. The Almighty displays His gentleness toward man. He is not only great, but Nisa. Nisa in the sense of being influenced and carried by others. Who influences the Almighty? The Jew who prays and is repentant. My Malamed, like all elders of Chabad, referred to the first night of Rosh Hashanah as the coronation night. This is because it is the occasion that the Jew gives a royal crown to the Almighty. The first time in the new year that the Jew declares, "Our God and God of our fathers reign over the whole universe in thy glory, O Lord King over all the earth, who grants thy royal crown to the Almighty, who gives the royal crown to the powerful master of the universe." My Malamed, along with many other poor Jews, granted the crown to the Almighty. It was a crown constructed of Jewish jeers and endless sacrifice for Torah. It was adorned with the love of Jews for the Almighty.
Wow, that's profound. What did you see in this excerpt? What did you read? What did it say to you?
My question is, what does it mean to give a crown to the Almighty? What would that mean for me to do that? Or so it's like, would say, what is the picture in my mind? And I don't have one. I just had not thought about that at all before.
Right.
What is that crown composed of? Why am I putting it there? What does that mean that my relationship is? That I would choose to do that.
Exactly. Why am I here?
Why are we here?
Why are we in the room? Why did I show up for services? Or maybe it's the fact that I showed up for services that I'm putting on that crown. You know?
It's remarkable that the Rav, who was a gadol, that he's speaking in mystical Kabbalistic terms, and he's saying that our tefillot, our prayers, have an effect on God, and that in a way that maybe he's asking the question like that God's kingship, God's monarchy, sovereignty over the world depends on us doing the crowning.
There is a mystical saying that says, "Ein melech below am." There's no king without a nation.
Right.
If I was the Sultan of Dubai or wherever, or Brunei, and I bought an island, and I decided, I'm the richest person in the world, but I want to be king. If I don't have subjects that have that relationship and I'm ruling, I can rule my whole family. I'm still a father. I can be a mayor of a city and enact judgments and rules on that city. I'm still not a king. There's a relationship. You need a nation to be able to give that king the ability for power. Without people following, there's no relationship. So I see you're sitting. You want to say something, so I'm going to stop and let you.
That's fine. Just listening. I'm thinking about the fact that, again, just from a liturgical perspective, that this gives me a lot of new kavanah for beginning Shachari with Hamelech. And I often think about how the Nusach in Eastern Europe for Hamelech very typically begins with a long drone on Ha, which is very atypical for Nusach. We don't want to dwell on the Ha. It's weird to dwell on an article. We try to dwell on something with meaning, like Melech, right? But the Hamelech moment there, instead of just Shochenat Maron B'Kadosh Shemo, just God's already sitting there, and He's going to be sitting there forever. just that coronation moment of bringing everybody into the room and saying that we are collectively doing that crowning, starting at Shachri together as a community in a completely different place than the rest of the year. And also just, I feel like it gives you more freedom to dwell on that moment and not feel so weird about it.
It's also, it seems to be a little bit out of place. I mean, the whole Malchiot, crowning of God as our king, is later on in Musaf. Why are we starting it at that point? Maybe it's a frame of reference. Maybe it's a trigger point to put the rest of the prayer into context.
I should say, I like the closing sentence talking about the crown constructed of Jewish cheers and endless sacrifice for Torah, because it gives us a real sense of the historical significance of it, and that it's just generations after generations after generations, and it continues. And I think that that's a really profound statement.
Wow. Yeah, definitely.
As you said before, human kings are going out of style altogether. And maybe we should take these psukim and these references in a symbolic way. That we say that we're crowning Hashem. We can't do anything to change Hashem, but we can do something to change our attitude towards Him. And so when we say Malchius, that's authority. That's ultimate authority. And that's what rules the world.
I'm game with that. That makes sense to me. Anybody have anything else they would add to this particular, the fact that we can, I underlined a couple ideas as we were talking, that human behavior can affect God. You think about God as this awesome thing that's all over, they tell a story where someone who's a skeptic approaches a rabbi and he says, "Oh, Rabbi, that God that you believe in, sitting upstairs and with his feet up and long beard, sitting and telling you do's and don'ts, and he's going to strike you down if you don't do it. I don't believe in that thing." So what's the rabbi's response? He says, "Well, I don't either." Creating a God that's relatable, that's not like out in the skies, but something that I can talk to, something that's real, is part of the experience on Rosh Hashanah. To be able to say that He's Avinu Malkeinu, that there's that personal experience in our relationship with God, is so important. It's so part and parcel of the Rosh Hashanah experience. There's a mashal, there's a parable that goes that is often compared to the month of Elul and Tishrei, of the king in the field. So the king decides he's going to scope out the, I'm sure of repeating something that everybody's familiar with, but he's deciding he's going to meet with his people. And he goes out and he makes himself available. And he walks around and he wants to know, what is the understanding? What are they doing? What are they dealing with? And then he finally, that's sort of the time of Elul as one prepares for the coronation, for the actual relationship with the king. And then he goes into his chambers and he dresses up in the crown of the king and the robes of the king. And at that point, anybody who wants to approach and makes an appointment and goes in there and asks for what they need, they approach him in the royal chambers. And I think that coronation of the king is very similar to what Soloveitchik is describing, that the God of our fathers reign in the whole universe in glory, a Lord, King over all earth. That's really part of the theme of what is going on Rosh Hashanah. The next theme actually will turn back to something that the Hamelach. I have a second source sheet which will go into that. And this is sort of all building up to the description on the original packet. I've heard many people say that this moment in Jewish history is a pivotal moment that really decided the survival of Jewish history for the future, for 2,000 years. Jerusalem is under siege. The possibility of remaining as a sovereign nation in Israel is dwindling. The infighting between different groups is terrible. And Rabbi Yochanan is faced with the challenge. Do I stay and fight, Do I stand here and hold my ground, or do I do my best to salvage what I can salvage for future generations? And they devise a plan for Rabbi Yochanan to fake an ailment, to pronounce his death, and smuggle him out in a coffin. And just being in Jerusalem 2 weeks ago, seeing the boulders of the rocks falling down, and imagining one of those gates, even though those gates aren't from that time period, but going through those gates and the zealots standing there ready to put a spear in the coffin to make sure that Rabbi Yochanan is actually dead. And even at that point, in that zealousness, he says, please respect the deceased. And they respect, he goes out, and then he finally approaches the tent, the camp of the Romans. And he arrives. Who would like to read the next source? Go for it.
When Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai arrived at the Roman camp, he said, "Peace unto you, king. Peace unto you, king." Vespasian said to him, "You are twice guilty of a capital crime. Once, because I am not a king, and you called me king. And further, because if I am a king, why did you not come to me until now?" Meanwhile, a messenger came to him from Rome. He said to him, "Rise, because Caesar has died, and the prominent men of Rome have decided to seat you at their head."
Yes. So I couldn't leave the the bolded quotation at the end of the story, but the main point over here is that you are twice guilty of a capital crime. Once, because I am not a king, and you call me a king. And further, because if I am a king, why did you not come to me until now? What do you read? What does it mean to you? As you ponder that, I'm going to hand out the second source sheet, as I learned from the first presenter today. I'm blanking on his name. Hand out the source sheets as you go. There's a curious thing
I think what stymies me with this is the second part of it is not difficult. If I'm the king, if God is the king, why didn't you come to God before now? That's not so difficult. The first piece challenges my belief that there is a God.
In what way?
Now, if I am not a king, if there is no God and you call me God, I mean, that is a really makes you think about, what do I believe? Am I an apostate? Am I a something else? Who am I? What is this relationship? Once you accept that there's a king who do stuff, yeah, you can go to him. It's that acceptance that's the challenge.
Right. One of the commentaries that talk about why does the Torah start with Bet and not Aleph of Anochi. So I always tell my students, I say, what's your frame of reference to reading the Bible? I asked the rabbi once, I said, what's the critical thinking of the Jewish people at Naaseh V'Nishma? Critical thinking. Judaism is full of critical thinking. Volumes and volumes of asking questions and deliberating. They show up and say, okay, whatever you say, we'll do it. They should say, okay, give us some time, we'll talk about it. We'll ask some questions, we'll put together a board and a committee, and we'll decide whether we're going to take what you want or not.
The mountain was hanging over our heads at that moment.
that's
Actually,
true.
That's a fear response. If you're looking at Deuteronomy, the passage that we just finished reading, you were afraid and you said to me, go up on the mountain. Like, okay,
whatever you say, we'll do.
The mountain over the head.
Here's another understanding. This rabbi, he said, they had a context to the conversation. Going out of Egypt, 40 days in the desert, all was building that personal relationship with God. So when God showed up at that mountain, saying, here, I've got this Torah for you. I've got this relationship, this nation that I want to build out of you. There was a context to that conversation. And so I believe that High Holidays has that time period of Elul. It's a context to that conversation similar to the 40 days of going out of the desert to Sinai. I am to my beloved and my beloved is to me. The curious story of a story in the Machzor. Growing up in the Chabad Machzor, this was one of the most puzzling things. If you look at the sheet that I sent out, usually a Machzor is just something that is just, okay, here's your prayer book. Printed in the Machzor is this story. Who would like to read the story or read it? Go for it.
Hamelech the king is an oft-occurring word in the Rosh Hashanah prayers, whose dominant theme is our coronation of God as King of the universe and our submission to his sovereignty. Indeed, it is the first word chanted by the cantor on Rosh Hashanah morning, as he opens the Shachrit prayers with an awe-inspiring melody that climaxes with a sonorous Hamelech. One Rosh Hashanah morning, the great Hasidic master, Rabbi Aaron Carlin, fainted when he came to the word of Hamelech. He later explained that he recalled the Talmudic passage that described Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's encounter with Vespasian. Rabbi Yochanan had himself smuggled out of the besieged city of Jerusalem to plead with the Roman general to spare the Torah center of Yavne. When Rabbi Yochanan entered Vespasian's tent, he addressed him as, Your Majesty. You are deserving of death on two accounts, said Vespasian. First of all, I am not the king, only his majesty's general. In fact, a messenger from Rome was already approaching the general's camp to inform him that he had been appointed sovereign of the empire. Second, if I am indeed king, why did you not come until now? I thought to myself, said the Rabbi of Carlin, if we address the Almighty as king, does this not invite the question, if I am indeed your king, why did you not come to me until now? What can we answer to that?
This is what you were saying.
Yeah.
Perfect.
That's what you were saying.
I was like jumping as you were saying it. I'm like, okay, this is at least I was able to progress this idea, and it finally brought to this point. What does this tell us? Why are we here? If I am the king, where have you been all year round? How many times do we have a high holiday where we have people in our synagogue, in our communities, who only show up that one time a year, right? If I am your king, where have you been all year round? How do we build that experience of the high holiday service in a way that is a catalyst not just for that one-time experience of someone coming into our doors, but channeling to be something greater, something that's a catalyst for larger engagement in the Jewish community, larger engagement with our synagogue, larger engagement as a people. And I think that for me, when I read that, that's where have you been? If you are the king, now you're recognizing the one time a year. How does that relationship, how does that realization translate throughout the year?
I'm wrestling as Catherine is with the first piece of Vespasian's answer, but even getting past the "you're twice guilty of a capital crime," but going to the next piece, because I am not a king and you called me king. But the truth is, at that moment, important point is he is already king. This is a fait accompli.
He's already left
This
Rome.
is the way it is already, and yet it's the engagement with that presence that creates the relationship. And so I think that's what Rabbi Soloveitchik was referring to, in that God is God, but it's on us, it's Aleinu, to be present in that relationship. God will remain God whether or not people come to Shul, but it's an invitation, it's an exhortation, it's a command, it's a welcoming to say that when when people can participate, even giving a little bit, that the relationship continues to be generated and move forward. But without it, God will be God.
Right.
But what greatness can we do if we acknowledge that?
And as you're saying that, I'm thinking maybe going back to Salvation, that we can change God. It is that empowerment that will bring people throughout the year. In a sense, I don't have a solution. I think it's something that we all struggle with.
No, I think you're right. When you just said God will be God, I was actually thinking, no, I think that God is kind of a little bit less than God when we choose not to show up. And I was just thinking that I saw a congregant a couple weeks ago, and it kind of triggered that I hadn't seen him in a couple weeks, and he comes every week. I said, oh, where have you been? And he was so happy that I said that. He didn't feel guilty. Other people feel really guilty, but he was so happy that I noticed that, which I rarely do, by the way. Very
I miss
oblivious
you.
to lots of things. So I just realized I hadn't seen him in the back where he always sits. And he said, I can't help it but say to you, I was wondering if anybody would notice. If another week would go by, people just wouldn't realize I didn't show up. And if there's a way we can, and I went home thinking that really affected me. Not comparing myself to God at all, but I would hope that that's the same relationship. If I did not show up week after week, would God be?
That's what I call a Jewish outlier moment.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of those moments that springboard someone to be inspired, to be connected in the community in Judaism and something that just by being sort of relational. It's my way of combining Malcolm Gladwell and Ron Wilson's idea of relational Judaism and outliers.
I think there's a challenge as rabbis that we look and say, why don't people believe that God is king? And if you did, why would you come? We are a very independent, self-centered society, and we say, well, I can do it myself. I don't need to come. I don't have time. I have something else to do. He's not really going to notice me. I don't believe he can do that. I mean, if we think through pondering on this some more, what all the possible answers are, it would be very interesting to put this to the congregation.
Absolutely.
Really interesting.
Have these
But
conversations.
probably a lot of squirming, but it would be interesting.
Well, you could do it in smaller cover also.
Isn't that what we really need to do on the high holidays? To use that Malchios idea to remind everybody that God is in our lives even when we don't show up. A few months ago we had Purim. Hashverosh is walking in his sleep, and how do you chant that? Amen. Right? To remind it wasn't only Hashverosh, it was the king upstairs too.
Right, absolutely. That's a good point. In closing, I was at a Sudash Lashit, depending on where you are, you have to say it differently. Last Shabbat afternoon, and one of the rabbis brought up this idea from an article titled "Pearls Before Breakfast" by Gene Weingarten from the Washington Post. And he talks about Joshua Bell, the amazing, and I actually Googled him and watched some of his playing, violinist. And in the Boston Symphony, he sells tickets for $100. And one day the Washington Post decided to do a experiment. And he shows up in subways in DC, and he starts playing. And of that, he played for 3/4 of an hour. 7 people stopped. 27 people gave him money. A total of $32. Over 1,000 people passed him by during that time. And I was thinking, how does this relate to our high holiday services? And the year. During high holiday services like the symphony, everybody's dressed in their best. Everybody's gathered together. There's all this build-up. Who's coming for high holidays? Do you have tickets? Where are your tickets? Who are you sitting next to? It's the opera. That build-up. You're sitting there, and it's almost I'm not going to be. I don't mean to be facetious, but it's a show in a sense. But during the year, it's Joshua Bell sitting in the subway with what percentage of our people, our communities, our friends and our neighbors just dropping him a coin, doing it because of Rebbe. Just taking a second once a week or once a month or once in a life cycle experience to take a step back and to participate. And the question is, what is that moment in our lives that challenges us to take a step back and actually engage in a deeper, more meaningful way? So that's the challenge I want to empower you with, is throughout the high holiday experience, to think about how do we build on that excitement, that spiritual experience throughout the year. It's compared to a boiler in a sense. When you need to heat up a room, you don't heat it up, you don't heat up the boiler to 70, 80 degrees. You heat it up to 1,000 degrees, and then you spread the heat. And so high holidays and that time of year is that time to warm up our conversations, congregants, and really strive to spread that throughout.